There's a version of you that nobody can shake, a version that doesn't flinch when someone comes at you sideways, doesn't replay conversations at night, doesn't feel the need to prove, defend, or explain. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because something inside you became unmovable. Most people never reach that state. They spend years reacting, adjusting themselves to fit expectations, carrying words that were never worth holding, and without realizing it, they slowly hand over control of their inner world to things that were never meant to have it. Stoic philosophy points to a different path, not suppression, mastery. The understanding that your peace is not something to be negotiated with the outside world. It's something you build, something you protect. The moment you stop reacting to everything, something shifts. You begin to see how much of your energy was being spent on things that never deserved it. And in that awareness, a quieter kind of strength starts to form. It's not loud, it doesn't need validation, it doesn't need to prove anything, but it's steady, grounded, and once you feel it, even briefly, it becomes clear that there's a completely different way to move through the world. One where you are no longer pulled by everything around you. Most reactions are not decisions. They feel like they are. But look closer. They happen too fast, too automatically, almost like they were waiting for the moment to take over. Someone says something slightly off, and before you even process it, your body shifts, your tone changes, your mind starts building a response. Not chosen, just familiar. That's what most people miss. These reactions don't come from clarity. They come from conditioning, from patterns repeated so many times they start to feel like identity. And over time, you stop questioning them. You start calling them who you are. Anything automatic is something you don't fully control. And if you don't control it, it controls you. That's where the real loss happens. Not in what was said, but in how easily it moved you. Your state shifts, your focus shifts, your energy follows, all because something external gained access it didn't deserve. And it happened before awareness had a chance to step in, before the pause. And that pause is everything. That's where choice lives. Without it, there is no decision, only repetition. This is where Stoic thinking becomes practical. You don't control what happens, you control how you respond. But that only works if there is space between the two. If everything is instant, control never enters the picture. And most people live like that. Reaction after reaction. All day, every day. They call it personality, they call it honesty, they call it being real. But if it isn't chosen, it isn't really you. It's just a pattern playing itself out. And patterns don't question themselves. They don't pause to ask if something is worth engaging with. They don't consider whether a response will improve anything or just feed the situation further. They just execute. Fast, predictable, mechanical. That's why reactions are easy to read. You push here, they respond there. The script rarely changes, and anything predictable can be influenced. That's the hidden cost of reactivity. It makes you easy to move. Not because people are always trying to control you, but because they could, if they wanted to. The patterns are visible, the triggers are clear, and those triggers were built over time, through repetition, through reacting without awareness. Each moment added to the map, a map of how to reach you. But this is where things begin to change. The moment you notice the reaction before it fully takes over, something shifts. Even if it's just a second, a small delay, a moment of awareness, that's where control begins. Not by eliminating the reaction, but by seeing it. Because once you see it, you're no longer fully inside it. There's distance. And in that distance, there's choice. This is what Epictetus meant when he said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That mastery isn't suppression. It's understanding. The ability to feel something without becoming it, to experience emotion without handing it control. That's where freedom begins. Not in controlling the world, but in no longer being controlled by your impulses. And the more you practice that pause, the clearer things become. You start to see how many reactions were unnecessary, how many moments would have passed on their own. Reacting doesn't resolve as much as it feels like it does. It extends things, gives them weight, keeps them alive, and slowly, silence stops feeling like weakness. It starts to feel like discipline. If this way of thinking is something you want to build into your life, not just understand, but actually live, then consider subscribing. Not for content, but as a quiet commitment to becoming more aware, more grounded, and more in control of what truly matters. What you begin to realize is that control isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small, quiet moments where you choose not to engage, where you feel the urge to respond, but you let it pass. Not because you can't respond, but because you don't need to. That shift, from needing to react to choosing whether to, is where everything changes. And once you experience that, even briefly, it becomes harder to go back. Because you've seen what it feels like to not be pulled by everything around you, to remain steady while things happen instead of because they happen. And that steadiness, that internal stability, starts to become more valuable than any temporary satisfaction a reaction could give you. If reacting is surrender, then silence begins to take on a completely different meaning. Not the kind of silence people associate with weakness, but a deliberate stillness. A refusal to participate in something that doesn't deserve your energy. Most people have been conditioned to believe that if something is said, it must be answered. If something is thrown at you, it must be caught and returned. That belief runs deep, and it shows up in subtle ways, in the urge to correct someone, in the need to defend your position, in the discomfort of letting a moment pass without stepping into it. But silence interrupts that entire pattern. It breaks the expectation that every action will be met with a reaction, and in doing so, it shifts the entire dynamic of the interaction. What makes silence powerful is not just the absence of words, but the presence of control. When someone directs something at you, they are, in a sense, initiating a loop. They act, expecting you to respond. That response completes the loop. It confirms that their action had an effect. It gives them feedback. It tells them that what they said or did reached you in some way. But when that response never comes, the loop stays open. There's no closure, no confirmation, just space. And in that space, something interesting begins to happen. The focus shifts away from you and back onto them. They are left alone with what they said without knowing how it landed or what it meant to you. That uncertainty creates tension, and most people are not comfortable with it. They rely on feedback to navigate social interactions. They look for cues, reactions, signals that tell them where they stand. When those signals disappear, it disrupts their sense of control. Suddenly, they are no longer guiding the interaction. They are guessing, interpreting, filling in gaps with their own assumptions. And often, those assumptions say more about them than anything you could have responded with. Silence, in this way, becomes a mirror. It reflects people back to themselves without interference. This is why being unreadable can feel unsettling to others. Not because you are doing anything aggressive, but because you are not participating in the usual exchange. There's no immediate reaction to analyze, no emotional cue to latch onto. Just calm, steady presence. And that presence, when it's genuine, carries a certain weight. It suggests that you are not easily moved, that your internal state is not dependent on what just happened. And that alone changes how people engage with you, because if they can't influence your reactions, they lose a certain level of control they might not have even realized they had. Silence also protects something that reactions often expose. Every time you respond emotionally, you reveal information. What bothers you, what you care about, where your boundaries are soft. That information doesn't just disappear, it gets stored, consciously or not, by the people around you. And over time it creates a kind of map, a way to predict how you might respond in the future. But when you choose silence, especially in moments where a reaction is expected, you give nothing away. No data, no emotional cues, just stillness, and that makes you harder to read, harder to predict, and ultimately harder to influence. There's a discipline to this that goes beyond simply not speaking. It's not about forcing yourself to stay quiet while internally reacting just as strongly as before. That kind of silence is fragile. It eventually breaks. Real silence comes from a different place. A place where the need to respond has already been questioned, where the impulse to engage has been examined and let go of. That kind of silence doesn't feel like suppression. It feels like clarity, like seeing something for what it is and deciding it doesn't require your involvement. And this clarity builds over time. The more you allow moments to pass without reacting, the more you start to see how many of them were never worth your energy in the first place. How many situations resolve themselves without your input? How many comments lose their weight when they are not acknowledged? It becomes clear that not everything needs your attention, and certainly not everything deserves your response. That realization is quiet, but it changes the way you move through the world. There's also a shift in how you perceive strength. It stops being about having the right comeback or winning the moment. It becomes about maintaining your state regardless of what happens, about staying grounded when something tries to pull you out of that position. And in that sense, silence is not passive at all. It is active restraint, a conscious decision not to engage, a decision that often requires more control than reacting ever would. This aligns closely with what Marcus Aurelius captured when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength doesn't come from dominating situations or controlling outcomes. It comes from understanding where your influence actually lies and choosing to operate within it. Silence becomes one of the clearest expressions of that understanding, not because it avoids conflict, but because it refuses to be controlled by it. Over time, this way of responding, or not responding, starts to reshape your interactions entirely. People begin to sense that you are not easily drawn into unnecessary exchanges, that your attention is not freely given to every situation that demands it, and with that comes a shift in how they approach you. Not always consciously, but noticeably. Because when someone realizes they can't easily provoke a reaction, they either adjust their behavior or lose interest altogether. And in either case, you remain unchanged. Not because nothing happens around you, but because you've stopped allowing everything to reach you in the same way. That is where silence becomes more than just a response. It becomes a boundary, one that doesn't need to be explained or defended. It simply exists, quietly shaping the way you engage with the world while keeping your control exactly where it belongs. It often comes down to something deeper than the moment itself. Not the comment, not the situation, not even the tone, but the quiet need underneath it. The need to be understood, to be seen correctly, to make sure that what someone thinks about you aligns with what you believe about yourself. And that need can feel reasonable at first, almost justified. After all, no one wants to be misunderstood. No one wants to be reduced to a version of themselves that doesn't feel accurate. So the instinct is to step in, to clarify, to explain, to reshape the narrative before it settles into something permanent. But there's a subtle shift that happens in that process, one that most people don't notice until it's already become a habit. Because the moment you begin explaining yourself to someone who has already formed a conclusion about you, the dynamic changes. You're no longer just communicating. You're negotiating, not facts, not reality, but identity. You're trying to move their perception from one place to another, hoping that if you say the right thing in the right way, they'll see you differently. But perception doesn't always work like that. It isn't built purely on logic or evidence. It's shaped by bias, by prior beliefs, by emotions that have nothing to do with you. And once someone has settled into a certain view, especially one that serves their own narrative, Changing it becomes far more difficult than it seems. That's where the real question begins to take shape. When you explain yourself in those situations, what are you actually doing? Are you revealing truth, or are you trying to gain approval? Are you clarifying reality, or are you adjusting yourself to fit into someone else's version of it? Because those are not the same thing, and the more often you step into that space, the more you reinforce a quiet dependence on how you are perceived. A dependence that slowly shifts your focus away from who you are and toward how you are seen. This is where Stoic thinking cuts through the noise with a kind of clarity that can feel uncomfortable at first. It draws a hard line between what is within your control and what is not. Your thoughts, your actions, your decisions, that's yours. But someone else's opinion, their interpretation of you, that has never belonged to you, not even for a moment. And yet, so much energy gets spent trying to manage it, trying to influence something that was never yours to influence in the first place. There's a certain illusion at play here. The belief that if you don't explain yourself, the misunderstanding will define you. That silence equals acceptance. That if you don't step in, their version becomes the truth. But truth doesn't operate that way. It isn't determined by who speaks the loudest or who explains the most. It exists independently of perception. The problem is, most people don't trust that. They feel the need to constantly reinforce who they are through words, through explanations, through corrections. And in doing so, they tie their sense of identity to something external and unstable. Over time, this creates a kind of tension, a subtle but persistent feeling that you need to keep adjusting, keep clarifying, keep making sure you're being seen the right way. And that tension doesn't just stay in isolated moments. It starts to shape how you move through the world. You become more cautious, more reactive, more aware of how everything might be interpreted. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to lose something important, your independence from other people's perceptions. That's why stepping back from this pattern can feel so unnatural at first. Choosing not to explain when you know you're being misunderstood goes against everything you've been conditioned to do. It feels like you're leaving something unfinished, like you're allowing an incorrect version of yourself to exist without correction. But what you're actually doing is reclaiming something that was never meant to be outsourced, your sense of self. This doesn't mean you never communicate or never clarify. There are moments where explanation is appropriate, where dialogue matters, where understanding can be reached. But those moments are different. They are grounded in mutual respect, in a genuine openness to see things clearly. Not in a one-sided effort to convince someone who has already decided not to understand you. And learning to recognize that difference changes everything. Because once you see it, the need to explain begins to lose its urgency. You start to realize that not every misunderstanding requires your involvement, that not every perception needs to be corrected, that sometimes the most grounded response is no response at all. Not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. A clear understanding of what is yours to manage and what is not. What remains is how you handled it. Whether you stayed grounded or got pulled into something unnecessary. Whether you held on to your sense of self or handed it over, even briefly, to someone else's opinion. And over time, those choices begin to shape something deeper than any single interaction. They shape your relationship with yourself. Because when you stop trying to manage how you are perceived, you free up a significant amount of energy. Energy that can be redirected towards something more stable, more meaningful. Your own actions, your own standards, your own direction. Instead of constantly looking outward for validation or correction, you begin to anchor yourself inward. And that shift, while quiet, is powerful. It doesn't make you indifferent in the sense of not caring. It makes you selective, careful about where your energy goes, aware of what actually deserves your attention. And that awareness becomes a kind of filter, one that protects you from getting pulled into every situation that invites a reaction, an explanation, or a defense. In the end, the goal is not to control how others see you. That was never possible. The goal is to become so clear on who you are that their perception no longer dictates your behavior. And once you reach that point, the need to explain begins to fade on its own, not because you've forced it away, but because you've outgrown it. Because now it's no longer about the original situation. It's about managing an image, maintaining a version of yourself that exists in someone else's mind. And that version is not stable. It shifts based on their mood, their perspective, their own internal narratives, which means you are constantly adapting to something that is constantly changing. That's where the entanglement begins. Slowly, subtly, you become more focused on how you are being perceived than on how you are actually living. And that shift, while easy to miss, comes at a cost. The cost is freedom, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, persistent way. You start filtering your actions through the lens of interpretation. You think about how something might be seen before you even do it. You adjust your behavior to avoid being misunderstood. And in doing so, you move further away from something simple but important: alignment with yourself. Instead of acting from clarity, you act from anticipation. Anticipation of judgment, of reaction, of perception. And that anticipation becomes a kind of invisible pressure that shapes your decisions without you fully noticing it. There's also a deeper layer to this. Much of what people project onto you has very little to do with you. It reflects their own experiences, insecurities, expectations. The way someone interprets your silence, your words, your actions often says more about their internal world than it does about yours. But when you take responsibility for correcting every misunderstanding, you unintentionally take ownership of those projections as well. You begin to treat them as problems you need to solve, rather than perspectives you don't control. And that misplacement of responsibility keeps you engaged in something that was never yours to carry. Stepping out of that pattern requires a shift that feels uncomfortable at first. Not because it's wrong, but because it goes against the instinct to fix, to clarify, to be understood. It requires you to accept that some people will see you incorrectly, that some narratives will exist without your input, that not every misunderstanding will be resolved. And instead of reacting to that, instead of trying to correct it, you allow it to exist without interference, not as a form of defeat, but as a form of clarity, a recognition that your role is not to manage perception, but to live in alignment with what you know to be true. This is where detachment begins to take shape, not as indifference, but as a form of discipline, a decision to stop engaging with something that doesn't lead anywhere meaningful. When you detach from the need to control how you are seen, you create space. Space to act without constantly second-guessing. Space to move without constantly adjusting. And in that space, something shifts internally. You become less reactive, less entangled, less dependent on external validation or correction. Carl Jung captured this dynamic in a way that cuts straight to the core when he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That idea flips the focus entirely. Instead of trying to fix how others see you, you begin to observe what their reactions reveal about them and sometimes about you. It becomes less about correcting and more about understanding. And that understanding creates distance. Not emotional distance in a cold sense, but psychological distance. Enough space to see things clearly without being pulled into them. From that position, your actions start to change naturally, not because you are forcing yourself to be different, but because you are no longer operating under the same pressure. You don't feel the need to respond to every interpretation. You don't feel compelled to explain every decision. You begin to trust that your actions, over time, will speak more clearly than any explanation ever could. And if they don't, if someone still chooses to see you a certain way, that becomes something you can accept without needing to intervene. Over time, this selectivity becomes part of how you move through the world. You stop getting pulled into unnecessary cycles. You stop engaging with narratives that don't serve you. And most importantly, you stop measuring yourself through the lens of someone else's perception. Because once you see how unstable that lens is, it loses its authority over you. What remains is something quieter but far more stable, a sense of alignment that doesn't depend on external validation, a way of being that isn't constantly adjusting itself to fit into shifting interpretations. And in that stability, the need to explain, to correct, to manage begins to fade, not because you've forced it away, but because it no longer feels necessary. Most conflicts don't exist in isolation. They grow through engagement, through responses, counter-responses, interpretations and reactions layered on top of each other. One comment leads to another. One misunderstanding expands into something bigger. And before long, what started as something small becomes something that feels significant, even overwhelming. But that growth doesn't happen on its own. It requires energy. It requires attention. It requires someone to keep it moving forward. And that's the part most people don't question. They step into these cycles without realizing that their involvement is what allows the situation to continue. When you remove that involvement, something shifts. Not always in a dramatic way, not instantly, but consistently. The cycle loses momentum. Without a reaction to build on, there's nothing to expand. Without engagement, there's nothing to escalate. It's like a fire without fuel. It might burn for a moment, but it doesn't last. And in that absence, you begin to see how many situations were sustained not by their importance, but by your attention to them. That realization is quiet, but it's significant. It changes how you approach things moving forward. This doesn't mean everything disappears immediately. Some situations linger. Some people continue their behavior regardless of your response. But even then, the dynamic is different. You are no longer contributing to it. You are no longer reinforcing it. And over time, that lack of reinforcement has an effect. Not always on the other person, but on you. You become less invested, less affected, less drawn into things that once would have consumed your attention. And that shift begins to create something new internally. What starts to form is stability. Not the kind that depends on everything going smoothly, but the kind that exists regardless of what's happening around you. A steady sense of self that isn't constantly adjusting to external input. Because when you stop reacting to everything, you also stop allowing everything to shape you. Your identity becomes less reactive, less fluid in response to outside forces, and more grounded in something consistent. Something that doesn't change every time someone says or does something unexpected. This is where the difference between performative strength and real strength becomes clear. Performative strength needs to be seen. It needs to respond, to assert itself, to make sure others recognize it. It reacts quickly, often loudly, because it's tied to how it appears. But real strength doesn't operate that way. It doesn't need to prove itself in every moment. It doesn't feel threatened by silence. It understands that not every situation requires a response, and that choosing not to engage is often the more controlled, more deliberate option. Over time, this way of operating becomes less about effort and more about habit. The same way reactions once felt automatic, restraint begins to feel natural. Not forced, not rigid, but steady. You don't need to remind yourself constantly. You don't need to analyze every situation. There's just a quiet understanding of what deserves your attention and what doesn't. And that understanding guides your behavior without the same internal conflict that used to exist. That presence is noticeable, even if it's not loud. People sense it, not always consciously, but they feel the difference, the lack of reactivity, the steadiness, the absence of unnecessary engagement. And that changes how they interact with you. Not because you're trying to influence them, but because you're no longer participating in the same patterns. And when patterns change, dynamics follow. What remains is something simple but powerful, a way of moving through the world that isn't dictated by every external input, a sense of self that isn't constantly being reshaped by what happens around you. And in that steadiness, you find something that reactions never provided. Not control over everything, but control over what actually matters. But staying in that place is not easy. It sounds simple when described, almost obvious when you think about it calmly, but in real moments it feels different. It feels unnatural to hold back when something inside you wants to respond. There's a kind of internal pressure that builds, a pull towards saying something, doing something, making sure the moment doesn't pass without your input. And when you choose not to follow that impulse, it can feel like you're doing something wrong, like you're letting something slide that shouldn't be ignored, like you're allowing behavior that deserves a response to go unchecked. That feeling is strong, and it doesn't disappear just because you understand the logic behind restraint. Part of that discomfort comes from how we've been conditioned to interpret action and inaction. Reacting is often associated with strength, standing your ground, speaking up, not letting things pass, while silence or non-reaction is often interpreted as weakness, as avoidance, as a failure to defend yourself. Those ideas are reinforced everywhere, in conversations, in media, in everyday interactions. The person who has a quick comeback is seen as sharp. The one who doesn't respond is often misunderstood. And because of that, choosing not to react can feel like going against something deeply ingrained. But when you look closer, the picture becomes less clear. Because reacting doesn't always mean you're in control. In fact, many reactions happen precisely because control is missing. They happen because something external triggered an internal response that moved you before you had a chance to decide whether you wanted to be moved at all. And if something can do that consistently, if it can shift your state, your focus, your behavior without your permission, then who is really in control in those moments? It doesn't feel like weakness when it's happening. It often feels justified, but justification and control are not the same thing. There's also the question of what you believe is being allowed when you don't react. It can seem like the other person is getting away with something, that by not responding, you are giving them permission or validating their behavior. But their behavior was never dependent on your response to begin with. They acted because of their own mindset, their own perspective, their own patterns. Your reaction doesn't change that. It only adds you into the situation. It ties your state to their action. And once that connection is made, the line between what belongs to you and what belongs to them starts to blur. This perspective shifts the focus entirely. Instead of asking whether someone else's behavior deserves a reaction, you begin to ask whether your reaction serves you, whether it aligns with how you want to move through the world, whether it brings you closer to clarity or pulls you further into something unnecessary. That shift is subtle, but it changes the way you evaluate situations. It turns reactions from automatic responses into deliberate decisions. Over time, this awareness starts to reduce the intensity of that initial impulse. The urge to respond doesn't disappear, but it becomes less urgent, less overwhelming. You start to see it as something that arises rather than something that must be followed. And in that space, your ability to choose becomes stronger. Not because you've eliminated the impulse, but because you've stopped identifying with it completely. There's also a shift in how you interpret situations themselves. Without the immediate reaction, you have more room to see things clearly, to understand context, to recognize when something is actually significant and when it's not. Many situations that once felt important begin to lose their weight, not because they've changed, but because your relationship to them has. You're no longer meeting them with the same level of automatic engagement. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent to everything. There are moments where action is necessary, where speaking up matters, where engagement is appropriate. But those moments become clearer when they are not mixed with constant reactivity. You can distinguish between what requires a response and what doesn't. And that distinction allows you to act more effectively when it actually counts. The process is gradual. There will be moments where you still react without thinking, where the old patterns take over. That's part of it. The goal isn't perfection, it's awareness. Each time you notice the reaction, whether before, during, or after, you strengthen that awareness. And over time, those moments begin to shift. The gap becomes more consistent. The choice becomes more accessible. What you start to build is not just restraint, but a kind of internal stability, a steadiness that isn't easily disrupted by external events. And that steadiness changes how you experience everything else. Because when you are not constantly reacting, you are not constantly being moved. And when you are not constantly being moved, you begin to feel something that goes beyond control. You begin to feel grounded. And in that grounded state, the question of whether reacting is strength starts to answer itself. Not through theory, but through experience. Through seeing the difference between being pulled into something and choosing whether to step into it at all. Through recognizing that what once felt like strength was often just a form of habit, and that real strength, the kind that lasts, is quieter, more deliberate, and far less dependent on what happens around you. Over time, something begins to shift, and it doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, almost unnoticeable at first, like a background change you only recognize when you stop and compare who you were before to who you are now. The same situations still happen, people still say things, circumstances still unfold in ways you don't control. But your internal response begins to soften, not in a weak way, but in a more stable, grounded way. The things that once pulled you in immediately, the comments that stayed with you longer than they should have, the moments that used to trigger a reaction without hesitation, they start to lose their intensity. Not because they've disappeared, but because something in you no longer meets them the same way. This is where the real change reveals itself. It's not in the external world, but in your relationship to it. You begin to see situations with more clarity, less distortion. Before, everything was filtered through immediate feeling. If something felt disrespectful, it was treated as significant. If something felt personal, it became personal. That emotional filter shaped your interpretation before you even had a chance to think. But as that space between stimulus and response becomes more consistent, you start to notice the difference between what something is and how it feels in the moment. And that difference changes everything, because when you see something clearly without the immediate overlay of emotion, it often looks smaller than it first appeared, less important, less deserving of your energy. You start to recognize patterns not just in others, but in yourself. What used to trigger you and why, what used to feel urgent and how that urgency fades when you don't immediately act on it. And in that recognition, your reactions begin to lose their automatic nature. They become optional instead of inevitable. That optionality creates distance. Not physical distance, but psychological distance. A space between you and the situation that allows you to observe rather than immediately participate. And in that space, there is a kind of freedom that most people never experience because they are constantly pulled into everything around them. They move from one reaction to the next without pause, without reflection, without that moment of separation that allows for choice. But once you start to operate from that distance, your entire experience of the same situations begins to change. You no longer feel the same pressure to respond, the same need to correct, the same urgency to engage. It's not that you've become indifferent to everything, but you've become more selective, more aware of what actually deserves your attention and what doesn't. And that awareness acts like a filter, quietly guiding your responses without requiring constant effort. You begin to conserve energy in a way that feels natural, not forced, because you're no longer giving it away to every situation that asks for it. There's also a shift in how long things stay with you. Before, a single moment could linger for hours, sometimes longer. Replayed, analyzed, expanded into something bigger than it was. But as your relationship to these moments changes, they start to pass more quickly. They come, they are noticed, and then they go. Without the same attachment, without the same need to revisit them. And that alone creates a noticeable difference in your mental state. Less noise, less repetition, more space. This is where a different kind of peace begins to emerge. Not the kind that depends on everything going well, on people behaving a certain way, on situations unfolding in your favor, but a steadier kind. One that exists even when things are imperfect, even when people are difficult, even when circumstances are not ideal. Because it's not built on controlling those things. It's built on your relationship to them, on your ability to remain grounded regardless of what happens externally. Carl Jung captured something close to this shift when he wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That line points to the same process happening here. The more aware you become of your patterns, your reactions, your internal responses, the less they control you. What once felt automatic begins to feel visible. What once felt inevitable begins to feel optional, and that awareness reduces the grip those patterns have on you. As that grip weakens, your sense of self becomes more stable. Not because you've built walls or disconnected from everything, but because you're no longer being constantly shaped by external inputs. Your identity stops shifting based on every interaction, every comment, every situation. It becomes more consistent, more rooted in something internal rather than something reactive. And that consistency brings a kind of quiet confidence. Not the kind that needs to be displayed, but the kind that simply exists. You also start to notice how different your interactions become. Without the same reactivity, without the same need to engage with everything, the dynamics change. Some situations dissolve on their own. Some people adjust their behavior. Others lose interest entirely. But regardless of what happens externally, your internal state remains more stable, less affected, less pulled in different directions. And that stability begins to influence everything else. Your focus, your decisions, your overall sense of clarity. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you become detached from everything in a way that disconnects you from life. It means you care more precisely. You engage more intentionally. You choose where your energy goes instead of letting it be dictated by every external trigger. And that precision makes your actions more meaningful, not less, because they come from a place of clarity rather than impulse. Over time, this becomes your default. Not something you have to think about constantly, but something that naturally guides how you respond to the world. The gap between stimulus and response becomes part of how you operate. The distance becomes familiar, the clarity becomes consistent, and with that, the intensity of many situations continues to fade, not because they've changed, but because you have. What remains is something that doesn't rely on circumstances to exist. A steadiness that holds even when things around you don't. A sense of peace that isn't fragile, that isn't easily disrupted, because it's not built on controlling the external. It's built on understanding your place within it. And once that understanding settles in, even quietly, it becomes difficult to lose. And eventually, without forcing it, without announcing it, you arrive at a point where silence no longer feels like something you're trying to do. It becomes how you naturally operate, not as a tactic, not as a temporary adjustment, but as a reflection of how you now see the world. The same situations still appear, the same opportunities to react, to explain, to engage, still present themselves. But something inside you has shifted enough that your default response is no longer to step into everything. You begin to move differently, more selectively, more deliberately. And that selectivity is not based on fear or avoidance, it's based on clarity. You no longer feel the same pull to respond to everything because you've seen, through experience, what most reactions actually lead to. You've seen how often they extend situations instead of resolving them. How often they pull you into cycles that don't add anything meaningful to your life. And once that becomes clear, the urge to participate begins to fade on its own. Not because you're suppressing it, but because it no longer makes sense in the same way. It's like recognizing a pattern that you used to follow without thinking. Once you see it clearly, it becomes difficult to go back to it without questioning why you're doing it at all. This is where engagement becomes intentional. You don't stop speaking. You don't stop acting. You simply become more precise about when and why you do those things. You speak when there is something worth saying, when your words serve a purpose beyond immediate reaction, when they align with something deeper than the moment itself, and when that purpose isn't there, you allow the moment to pass without interference. Not as a form of withdrawal, but as a form of discipline. A quiet recognition that not everything requires your involvement. There's a noticeable difference in how this feels internally. Before, silence might have felt tense, like holding something back, like resisting an impulse that was pushing to come out. But now it feels calm, natural. There's no internal conflict about whether to respond. The decision is already made not through effort, but through understanding. You see the situation, you recognize its weight, and you respond accordingly, or you don't. And in many cases, not responding becomes the most aligned option. This doesn't isolate you from the world. If anything, it allows you to engage with it more effectively because your attention is no longer scattered across every minor situation. It's focused, directed toward what actually matters, toward conversations that are meaningful, toward actions that have impact, toward relationships that add something real to your life. Everything else loses its urgency, not because it disappears, but because it no longer meets your threshold for engagement. There's also a shift in how others perceive you, though that's not something you aim for. It happens as a byproduct. When you stop reacting the way people expect, when you stop explaining yourself in situations where explanation used to be automatic, the dynamic changes. People notice the absence of what used to be predictable, the lack of immediate response, the calmness where there used to be engagement, and that difference stands out. Even if it's not consciously analyzed. Some interpret it as confidence, others see it as distance, some may even misunderstand it entirely. But regardless of interpretation, the effect is similar. Your presence begins to carry a different kind of weight. Not because you're trying to project anything, but because you're no longer participating in the same patterns. And when patterns break, attention follows. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts in how people approach you, how they speak to you, how they engage with you. This is where a certain irony appears. The less you try to be seen, the more noticeable you become. The less you try to prove something, the less there is to question. Because when someone isn't constantly reacting, constantly explaining, constantly adjusting themselves to fit into every situation, there's a sense of stability that becomes difficult to ignore. Not loud, not performative, but consistent. And consistency, over time, creates a kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. That presence is not built on controlling others or shaping their perception. It's built on something much simpler: alignment. Acting in a way that reflects your understanding, your values, your clarity, without constantly adjusting for external reactions. And that alignment removes a lot of the internal noise that used to exist, the second-guessing, the overanalyzing, the need to constantly evaluate how something might be perceived. All of that begins to quiet down when your actions are no longer dependent on those variables. This connects closely to what Marcus Aurelius expressed when he wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." The emphasis is not on explaining, not on defining, not on convincing others. It's on living in a way that reflects what you already understand. And once you operate from that place, the need to constantly engage in explanation or reaction begins to dissolve, because your actions carry more clarity than your words ever could. Over time, this becomes less of a conscious effort and more of a natural state. You don't need to remind yourself to stay silent. You don't need to analyze every situation. The filter is already there. The understanding is already in place, and that allows you to move through situations with a kind of ease that wasn't there before. Not because things have become simpler, but because your relationship to them has. What remains is a quiet consistency, a way of being that doesn't shift with every external change. A sense of control that isn't about dominating situations, but about not being dominated by them. And in that space, silence is no longer something you use. It's something you are comfortable with, not because you have nothing to say, but because you know when saying nothing is the strongest position you can take. At the end of it all, it comes down to something simple. Not easy, but simple. You don't need to win every moment. You don't need to explain yourself to everyone. You don't need to react to prove your strength. The real shift happens when you realize that your peace is worth more than being understood by people who were never trying to understand you in the first place. Stay with that. Build on it. Let it shape how you move, how you respond, and more importantly, how you choose not to. Because the version of you that is calm, grounded, and unaffected by what doesn't matter, that version is already there. It's just waiting on your decisions. If this resonated with you, there's another video on your screen that will take this even deeper. Watch it while this mindset is still fresh. And thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.